It all came to a head one night in my own living room. Jason, my wife's so-called work husband, thought he could push me around under my own roof. After months of his smug comments and blatant disrespect, he crossed the ultimate line. He tried to humiliate me in front of Clara. That's when I snapped. I wasn't about to let this arrogant alpha belittle me any longer. Let's just say he left my house with more than a bruised ego and 2 broken hands to remember it by. But before we dive into the full story, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. And if you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to hit subscribe and tap the notification bell so you never miss what's next. Let's get into it. Eric leaned against the kitchen counter, watching Clara hum softly to herself as she arranged flowers in a vase. The late afternoon sunlight streamed through the window, catching the golden highlights in her hair. She turned toward him with a warm smile, holding out a single daisy. "For you?" she teased, slipping it into his hand. Eric chuckled, tucking the flower behind his ear with exaggerated flair. "How do I look?" "Absolutely ridiculous," Clara laughed, crossing the room to kiss him lightly on the cheek. Moments like this were the foundation of their marriage. Simple, effortless, and full of affection. Despite their busy lives, they always found time for each other. Eric worked long hours as a software engineer, while Clara, a marketing strategist, often juggled deadlines and client calls. Yet they made it work, carving out pockets of quiet joy in their otherwise hectic schedules. "Dinner's almost ready," Eric said, stirring a pot on the stove. "Perfect timing," Clara replied, leaning against him. "You're the best, you know that?" "Yeah, I try," he said, wrapping an arm around her waist. As they stood there, the smell of rosemary and garlic filling the air, Eric couldn't imagine a better life. Later that evening, as they sat on the couch, Clara scrolled through her phone, laughing softly. "I suppose maybe a little of anything is probably healthy," said Jessie, smiling as she pressed the like button to start the tape. "What's so funny?" Eric asked, setting down his glass of wine. "Oh, just Jason," she said, still grinning. "He sent the most ridiculous meme. Here, look." She held out her phone and Eric glanced at the screen. It was a picture of a cat wearing a tie, captioned with a pun he didn't entirely understand. "Jason, from work?" he asked casually. "Yeah, Jason," Clara confirmed. "He's hilarious. Keeps the office so much fun, especially during those late-night projects." Eric nodded, smiling faintly. "Well, it's good you've got someone to make the long hours more bearable." "Oh, exactly," Clara said, her tone light. "You'd like him, Eric. He's just easy to get along with. A real goofball." Eric let the conversation flow, but a faint ripple of unease passed through him. It wasn't jealousy. He trusted Clara implicitly, but he couldn't shake the feeling that Jason's name had been coming up more often lately. The second day of school, the weather still tropical, he called the school library for his pad. He dismissed the thought as quickly as it came. After all, Clara was the love of his life, and their bond was unshakable. What harm could a little office friendship do? As the weeks passed, Jason's name began weaving itself into more of Clara's conversations. Over dinner one evening, she recounted a work meeting that had gone awry. "Jason saved the day again," Clara said, laughing as she picked at her pasta. "He has this way of lightening the mood even when the client's being impossible. You should have heard the joke he made. Had everyone cracking up." Eric nodded, a faint smile on his lips. "Sounds like he's good for morale." "Exactly," Clara said enthusiastically. "It's rare to find someone like that in such a high-pressure environment." Although her tone was casual, Eric couldn't help but notice the ease with which she spoke about Jason. Still, he pushed the thought aside. Clara was simply sharing her day, as she always did. A few days later, while folding laundry, Eric noticed Clara's phone lighting up on the nightstand. The notification preview read, "Jason, you won't believe what just happened. Brenda." "Clara, your phone's buzzing," Eric called out. "Can you check it for me?" she asked from the bathroom. Eric hesitated before responding. "It's just a text from Jason." "Ah, he's probably following up on the campaign," she said casually. Eric set the phone down, shaking his head at himself. There was nothing unusual about a coworker texting about work, even outside office hours. He trusted Clara. Later that weekend, while they were out grocery shopping, Clara's phone vibrated again. She glanced at the screen and chuckled softly. "Jason?" Eric guessed, trying to keep his tone light. Clara nodded. "He sent another meme. You know, if I didn't know better, I'd think he's trying to become my personal comedian." Andrea shrugged and started down the stairs to grab her jacket. Eric forced a laugh. "Good to know you're entertained." While Clara scrolled through her messages, Eric grabbed a carton of eggs, his thoughts swirling. It wasn't the texting itself that bothered him. It was the frequency. Jason seemed to be present even in their personal moments, like a guest who hadn't been invited but refused to leave. That night, as they lay in bed, Eric tried to push the unease away. He reminded himself of the foundation of their relationship, trust. Clara had given him no reason to doubt her, and he wasn't about to start now. "I have to believe that you want to do well," he told her. It started innocuously enough. During one of their regular dinners, as Eric set the table and Clara poured wine, her phone buzzed on the counter. She glanced at it and smiled, quickly typing out a response. "Work?" Eric asked, placing the last plate down. "Jason," Clara replied absent-mindedly. "He's just venting about the client from hell today." Eric chuckled softly. "Must have been a rough one." Clara nodded, but as they began eating, her phone buzzed again. She gave an apologetic smile and reached for it. "Sorry, it'll just take a second," she said, fingers flying across the screen. Eric waved it off. "No problem." But as her attention flicked between him and her phone for the rest of the meal, he couldn't help feeling like an outsider to her conversation. Over the following days, the interruptions became more frequent. During a quiet evening in front of the TV, Eric noticed Clara's phone lighting up repeatedly. She giggled softly as she read the messages, her expression relaxed and amused. "Jason again?" Eric asked, keeping his tone light. "Yeah," Clara said, not looking up. "He's just sharing this ridiculous office drama. You wouldn't believe half the stuff that happens." Eric forced a smile. "Sounds entertaining." Clara nodded, still engrossed in her phone. The warmth of their shared moment seemed to fade, leaving Eric staring at the screen alone. Alone. Then there were the late-night texts. Eric would be brushing his teeth or lying in bed when the faint chime of Clara's phone broke the silence. She'd glance at the screen, her face illuminated in the dim light, and either laugh quietly or start typing back. "Still Jason?" Eric asked one night, trying to sound casual. "Mm-hmm," Clara murmured. "He's working late and just needed a sounding board." Eric nodded, turning over onto his side. He told himself it was harmless, just work banter spilling over after hours. Yet, he couldn't shake the feeling of being excluded, like a third wheel in his own marriage. Despite his growing unease, Eric said nothing. Clara was his wife, his partner, the woman he trusted above all else. And so he stayed silent, convincing himself that this phase would pass, even as Jason's presence loomed larger in their lives. It was Clara's idea to invite Jason and his girlfriend Megan over for dinner. "You'll see why I talk about him so much," she had said, flashing a smile that Eric couldn't resist. Reluctantly, he agreed, hoping the evening would ease some of the discomfort Jason's growing presence had caused. They went back to their car. The night began smoothly. Eric had prepared one of his signature dishes, and the smell of garlic and rosemary filled their cozy dining room. When the doorbell rang, Clara rushed to open it, greeting Jason with a warm hug that lingered just a second too long for Eric's comfort. Megan followed closely behind, offering a polite but somewhat tense smile. "Smells incredible in here," Jason said, stepping inside and surveying the space. "Eric, you're a lucky guy. Clara's always talking about what a great cook you are." "Glad to have you both," Eric replied, forcing a smile as he shook Jason's hand. As the evening progressed, Jason quickly took over the conversation. He regaled them with office anecdotes, seamlessly directing the spotlight onto himself. "And then Clara swoops in," Jason said, grinning as he leaned back in his chair. saving the day like she always does. Honestly, Eric, I don't know how you keep up with her brilliance. Eric chuckled stiffly. She's amazing, no question about it, but we make a pretty good team. Jason raised an eyebrow, his smirk unwavering. A good team? Sounds diplomatic. He glanced at Clara, who laughed softly, missing the tension in Eric's jaw. Megan, meanwhile, grew noticeably quiet as the evening wore on. She smiled faintly at Jason's jokes but avoided direct eye contact with him. Eric couldn't help but notice her glances toward Clara, as if trying to gauge her reactions. He managed to maintain the same thought process he'd used the previous night. During a lull in the conversation, Jason reached over, casually brushing a strand of Clara's hair off her shoulder. "You've got something there," he said, his tone light. Clara seemed unbothered, offering a quick thanks, but Eric's grip tightened on his fork. Megan shifted uncomfortably, reaching for her wine glass. By the time dessert was served, the undercurrent of unease had grown palpable. Megan excused herself to step outside, claiming she needed some air. "She okay?" Clara asked, concerned. Jason waved it off. "She gets anxious in social settings sometimes. Nothing to worry about." Eric wasn't so sure. As the door closed behind Megan, he couldn't shake the feeling that her discomfort had more to do with Jason than the evening itself. When the night finally came to an end, Eric walked Jason and Megan to the door. Jason clapped him on the shoulder, his grin wide and disarming. "You've got a great thing going here, man. Clara's one of a kind." Eric felt Jason's warmth presence for a few minutes, before he noticed the crowd had drawn in. Eric's smile didn't reach his eyes. "I know." As they drove away, Eric and Clara stood in silence for a moment. "Well, that was fun," Clara said brightly, oblivious to the tension Eric felt radiating from every corner of the evening. "Yeah," Eric replied, his voice distant. "Fun." Inside, the warmth of the evening had turned cold. In the days following the dinner, Eric found himself paying closer attention to the dynamic between Clara and Jason. At first, he told himself he was being paranoid, but small moments kept gnawing at him, subtle yet impossible to ignore. One afternoon, Eric stopped by Clara's office to surprise her with lunch. As he approached her desk, he saw Jason leaning over Clara's chair, pointing at her screen. Their heads were close together, Jason's laugh cutting through the quiet hum of the office. Clara looked up, startled but pleased to see Eric. "Eric," she exclaimed, standing to give him a quick hug. "What are you doing here?" "Thought I'd bring you something to eat," he said, holding up the takeout bag. Jason straightened, flashing his trademark grin. "Now that's a thoughtful husband. You've set the bar high for the rest of us." Eric forced a polite smile. "Just keeping her fueled for all those late nights." Jason chuckled. "Trust me, she's the powerhouse around here. We'd all be lost without her." The compliment felt genuine, but Eric couldn't shake the way Jason lingered as Clara unpacked her lunch. Even after Eric arrived, Jason stayed a moment too long, only leaving when Clara gently shooed him back to his desk. Later that week, Eric sat at the kitchen table, scrolling through his emails while Clara was on the phone. She was laughing again, her voice light and carefree. "That's ridiculous, Jason," she said, her tone teasing. "No way would that ever work." Eric glanced up from his laptop. "Jason again?" Clara nodded, covering the phone. "Just some work thing, give me a sec." Eric gave a faint nod and returned to his screen, but his focus was gone. He couldn't pinpoint why it bothered him so much. Clara's laughter was natural, not flirtatious, but the constant interruptions were beginning to chip away at his patience. The following weekend, Eric and Clara attended a team barbecue hosted by her company. It was meant to be a casual gathering, but Eric found himself watching Jason more than anyone else. At one point, Jason approached Clara with a drink, handing it to her with an easy familiarity. "You looked like you could use a refill," he said, his smile effortless. "Thanks," Clara replied, barely noticing Eric standing a few feet away. Eric joined them moments later, slipping an arm around Clara's waist. Jason acknowledged him with a brief nod but didn't move away. Instead, he launched into another work story, this time highlighting a moment where he and Clara had collaborated. "You should have seen her," Jason said, his tone animated. Clara was unstoppable. Honestly, she's got this instinct that's just, well, rare. Eric clenched his jaw but said nothing, unsure how to counter the growing unease he felt. At home that evening, as Clara recounted stories from the barbecue, Eric tried to gauge her perspective. "Jason sure talks a lot about you," he said, keeping his tone neutral. Clara laughed. "Well, we work together all the time. It's not that unusual." Eric hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah, I guess." But in the back of his mind, doubt was taking root. Jason wasn't just a coworker, he wasn't just a friend, and Eric was starting to wonder if Clara realized that, or if she was choosing not to see it. Except for the few times they got past the corporate dark web, when Clara went deeper into the web, the first instance of Jason's condescension came during a casual brunch Clara had organized for a few coworkers and friends. Jason arrived late, greeting Clara with a broad smile and a too familiar pat on her shoulder. As everyone chatted, Jason took it upon himself to steer the conversation, especially toward Clara. Jason said, setting his coffee cup down with a smirk, "we'd all be sunk without Clara at the office. She's a miracle worker. Not everyone has the stamina or drive to handle the things she does." Eric raised an eyebrow, sensing the undertone. "She's incredible, no doubt about it," he said firmly. "But Clara and I both work hard to support each other. It's teamwork." Jason chuckled, the sound low and dismissive. "Teamwork's great and all, but sometimes you just need someone who can take charge." His gaze lingered on Clara, and Eric felt a flicker of irritation. Later that week, Jason's patronizing tone escalated during a shared outing with mutual friends. The group had gathered at a park for a picnic, and as Eric worked the grill, Jason wandered over, beer in hand. "You're a lucky man, Eric," Jason said, leaning against the table. Eric glanced at him. "I know I am." Jason shrugged, taking a long sip from his bottle. "Just saying. Women like Clara, ambitious, driven, they're rare. Not everyone can keep up with that kind of energy." Eric's grip on the spatula tightened, but he forced a smile. I think I managed just fine." Jason smirked. "If you say so. But hey, no shame in it. Some people are better at stepping back and letting their partners shine." The comment felt like a slap, veiled in politeness but laced with disdain. Eric looked directly at Jason. "Clara and I don't measure our worth by who outshines who. We're equals." Jason chuckled again, his tone insincere. "Sure thing, man. Whatever works for you." The next time Jason's behavior crossed the line, Eric couldn't let it slide. During a group dinner at a local restaurant, Jason leaned into one of his anecdotes about Clara's work brilliance, ending with, "Honestly, Clara deserves the world. If I were in your shoes, Eric, I'd be pulling out all the stops to make sure she knew it." Eric's smile was tight, his voice calm but pointed. "Thanks for the advice, Jason, but I think Clara knows exactly how much she means to me." Clara, seated between them, laughed nervously. "All right, boys, let's change the subject. This is getting a little intense." After the dinner, Eric brought up his concerns to Clara in the car. "Did you hear the way Jason talks to me?" Eric asked, his voice controlled but tense. Clara sighed. "He doesn't mean anything by it, Eric. That's just how he is. He's blunt, sure, but he's harmless." "Harmless," Eric repeated, incredulous. "He's constantly making these digs, like I'm not good enough for you. How do you not see that?" Clara shook her head. "You're reading too much into it. Jason respects you. He talks about you at work all the time." "Funny, it doesn't sound like respect when I'm standing right there," Eric shot back. Clara frowned but didn't respond, leaving Eric staring out the window, frustration gnawing at him. Jason's overconfidence seemed to grow in direct proportion to Clara's dismissal of Eric's concerns. Each interaction left Eric feeling more sidelined, and Jason's subtle jabs became sharper. Eric couldn't ignore it anymore. Jason wasn't just crossing lines, he was erasing them. It was late on a Wednesday evening when Eric's phone buzzed with an unexpected message. He glanced at the screen, his brow furrowing as he saw Megan's name. They had barely exchanged more than pleasantries during the dinner, so her reaching out directly was unusual. "Hey Eric, can we talk? It's about Jason. It's important." Curiosity mixed with unease. Eric hesitated, then replied, "Sure. What's going on?" Megan responded quickly, asking if he could step outside to call her. Clara was in the next room, engrossed in a TV show, so Eric quietly slipped out to the porch, the cool night air prickling his skin as he dialed. "Thanks for calling," Megan said, her voice low and hurried. "I've been debating whether to reach out, but after that dinner and some things I've noticed, I felt like I had to say something." "What kind of things?" Eric asked, leaning against the porch railing. There was a brief pause on the line before Megan exhaled. "Jason's done this before," she admitted. "He gets close to female coworkers, especially ones in relationships. He charms them, acts like the supportive friend, but it always escalates. It's like he enjoys creating cracks in their relationships, testing how far he can push things." Eric's stomach tightened as he listened. "Are you saying this is a pattern for him?" "Yes," Megan confirmed. "I've seen it happen. Back at his previous job, he caused so much tension between a married coworker and her husband that they ended up separating. He acted innocent, of course, but everyone knew he'd been stoking the fire. It's like he thrives on it." "Does Clara know about this?" Eric asked, his voice sharper than he intended. "I doubt it," Megan replied. "He's careful. He knows how to play the long game. Never anything overt, just little comments, gestures. By the time people realize what's happening, it's too late." Eric was silent for a moment, processing her words. On one hand, he felt a sense of vindication. His instincts about Jason hadn't been unfounded. On the other, he was gripped by a new wave of frustration. How could he bring this up to Clara without sounding jealous or controlling? "Why are you telling me this now?" Eric finally asked. "Because I see the signs," Megan admitted. "The way he acts around Clara, the way he talks about her, it's familiar. I don't want you two to end up like the others. You seem like a good guy, Eric, and Clara seems great, but Jason doesn't care about that." After hanging up, Eric stood on the porch for a long moment, staring out into the dark. Megan's words echoed in his mind, solidifying the nagging doubts he'd been trying to suppress. Jason wasn't just overstepping. He was manipulating. When Eric went back inside, Clara glanced up from the couch. "Everything okay?" she asked. "Yeah," Eric said, forcing a smile. "Just a quick call." But as he sat beside her, he couldn't shake the weight of what Megan had shared. The evidence was mounting, yet he knew bringing it up to Clara would be tricky. Jason had woven himself into her world so thoroughly that any critique of him could easily be misinterpreted as jealousy. The next morning, Eric decided to broach the topic carefully. Over coffee, he casually mentioned, "You ever hear anything about Jason's old job?" Clara looked up, confused. "What do you mean?" "I don't know," Eric said, keeping his tone light. "Just wondering if he's ever talked about why he left." Clara shrugged. "Not really. He said it was time for a change." "Why?" "No reason," Eric replied. But his mind was racing. He couldn't confront her with Megan's claims, not yet. He needed her to see Jason's behavior for what it was, without it seeming like he was planting seeds of doubt. For the rest of the day, Eric's frustration simmered beneath the surface. Megan's warning had given him clarity, but also deepened his sense of helplessness. He needed to protect his marriage, but how could he fight a battle Clara didn't even realize they were in? The party was in full swing when Eric and Clara arrived, the sound of laughter and music filling the air. It was a gathering of Clara's colleagues, a casual celebration of their recent project success. Eric had been hesitant about attending, but Clara had insisted, saying it would be fun and a chance to unwind. Jason was already there when they walked in, drink in hand, and his usual grin plastered across his face. He waved them over immediately. "The stars of the night," he said, his eyes lingering on Clara as he handed her a glass of wine. Eric clenched his jaw but said nothing, determined not to let Jason's behavior ruin the evening. As the night went on, Eric did his best to mingle, but his focus kept drifting to Jason and Clara. Jason's overfamiliarity was undeniable, his hand on her shoulder when he laughed, the way he leaned in just a little too close. Clara didn't seem to notice, laughing at his jokes and engaging in lively conversation. Then came the moment that changed everything. Eric had stepped away briefly to grab a drink, and when he returned, he overheard Jason talking to a small group that included Clara. His voice was loud, his tone playful, but the words hit Eric like a slap. "Well, if Eric's ever too busy to take care of Clara," Jason said with a smirk, "you all know where to find me." Laughter erupted from a few people in the group, but Clara's smile faltered. She opened her mouth to respond, but before she could, Eric stepped in. Working together to get to know each other begins with understanding each other's lives. "What the hell did you just say?" Eric's voice was low but seething, drawing the attention of everyone nearby. Jason turned to him, unfazed. "Relax, man. It was just a joke." "It wasn't a joke," Eric snapped. "That was disrespectful." "Eric, stop," Clara said, placing a hand on his arm. "It's not a big deal." "Not a big deal?" Eric turned to her, incredulous. "He just implied." She fell into step with him as they moved away from the spectators. "Imply what?" Jason interrupted, stepping closer. "That I care about Clara? Because I do. She deserves someone who appreciates her, and maybe that's something you should think about." Barrett relented and looked at Jason again. The room fell silent as tension crackled between them. Eric didn't think. He reacted. Grabbing Jason by the collar, he shoved him back, his voice sharp and trembling with anger. "You don't get to talk about my wife like that." Jason raised his hands in mock surrender, his smirk still infuriatingly intact. "Wow, guess I hit a nerve." "What's the matter, Eric? Feeling insecure?" Before Eric could respond, Clara stepped between them, pushing them apart. "Enough," she shouted, her eyes darting between the two men. Eric stared at her, breathing heavily. "You're defending him?" "It didn't mean it the way you think," Clara said, her tone pleading. "How can you still defend him after everything?" Eric demanded, his voice rising. "Do you even realize what he's been doing?" Jason chimed in, his voice dripping with mock innocence. "What I've been doing? You're the one causing a scene, Eric." The argument spilled out in front of everyone, the room now awkwardly silent. Clara grabbed Eric's arm, trying to pull him aside. "Let's talk about this somewhere else," she said through gritted teeth. "No," Eric said, pulling his arm free. "I'm done pretending this is normal. Jason's been crossing lines for months and I'm sick of it." Jason laughed, a cold, mocking sound. "You're paranoid, man. Maybe take a look at yourself before pointing fingers." That was the final straw. Eric lunged forward, but several people stepped in, pulling him back. Jason, now flustered but still smug, adjusted his collar and muttered something under his breath that Eric couldn't hear. But the smirk said it all. Clara turned to Eric, her face a mix of anger and embarrassment. "This is exactly what I was afraid of," she said, her voice low but firm. "What you were afraid of?" Eric asked, his voice cracking. "You're blaming me? After everything he's done?" "Hasn't done anything, Eric," Clara snapped. "He's my friend, and you're blowing this way out of proportion." "Friends?" Eric repeated bitterly. "You think friends make comments like that? You think friends act like they're part of your marriage?" Clara's face hardened. "I think you're letting your insecurities ruin what was supposed to be a fun night." Eric stared at her, the weight of her words cutting deeper than Jason's smirk ever could. Without another word, he turned and walked out, the cool night air doing little to calm the fire raging inside him. A moment later, as he drove home alone, his thoughts raced. Clara's defense of Jason felt like a betrayal, a refusal to see the truth that was staring them both in the face. He knew he had crossed a line by getting physical, but Jason had crossed so many more, and Clara couldn't or wouldn't see it. Back at the house, Eric sat in silence, the tension and frustration boiling over into exhaustion. When Clara finally came home hours later, they didn't speak. She went straight to bed, leaving the chasm between them wider than it had ever been. The next morning, the house was thick with silence. Eric sat at the kitchen table, staring at his untouched coffee, while Clara moved around the room with deliberate calm, avoiding his gaze. The tension was palpable, a crackling undercurrent that neither could ignore any longer. Finally, Eric broke the silence. "We need to talk." Clara sighed, setting her mug down with a clink. "I figured this was coming. Go ahead." Eric took a deep breath, trying to steady his voice. "This isn't just about last night. It's about Jason. About how he's been crossing lines since the beginning." Clara frowned, her tone defensive. "Jason's my friend, Eric. He hasn't done anything wrong." "You're the one who turned this into something it's not." Eric's frustration bubbled to the surface. "Do you hear yourself? He makes comments about taking care of you, touches you like he has the right, and undermines me every chance he gets. And you think that's normal?" Clara shook her head, her voice rising. "He's just joking. That's his personality. You're reading way too much into it." Eric leaned forward, his voice sharp but controlled. "It's not just me. Megan called me. She told me Jason has a history of this. Getting close to women, driving wedges between them and their partners. This isn't a one-off, Clara. It's a pattern." Clara's face twisted with disbelief. "Megan called you? Are you serious? She's probably just bitter about their relationship. You don't even know the full story." "I know enough," Eric said firmly. "I know that Jason thrives on manipulation, on making people question their own relationships, and you're letting him do it to us." Clara's jaw tightened, her eyes flashing with hurt and anger. "Letting him? I haven't done anything wrong, Eric. I can't control what he says or does, and I shouldn't have to defend myself just because I have a friend who happens to be a man." "This isn't about you having a male friend," Eric countered, his voice rising. "It's about him intentionally crossing boundaries and you refusing to see it. Do you even realize how much time he takes from us? How often he's intruding into our lives?" Clara folded her arms, her voice icy. "Maybe if you trusted me, we wouldn't even be having this conversation." "I don't trust you, Athena." Eric laughed bitterly, the sound void of humor. "Trust? Trust isn't the issue here. The issue is that you're so blinded by his charm that you can't see how he's undermining our marriage." The words hung in the air, heavy and unyielding. Clara stared at him, her expression a mix of defiance and pain. "I can't believe you're accusing me of that," she said softly, her voice trembling. "I'm not accusing you," Eric said, his voice softening but still firm. "I'm trying to protect us, our marriage, but I can't do it alone." Clara shook her head, tears brimming in her eyes. "I don't even know what to say to you right now." "Then don't say anything," Eric said, standing up. "Just think about it. Think about everything Jason's done, and ask yourself if this is really okay." As he walked out of the room, the silence returned, heavier than before. Both of them felt the weight of what had been said and what hadn't, hanging between them like a chasm they weren't sure how to cross. It was an unusually quiet afternoon in the office. Most of the team had left early after wrapping up a major project, but Clara stayed behind to finish some lingering emails. As she passed the break room on her way to refill her coffee, she heard Jason's voice. At first it was just background noise, muffled by the hum of the coffee machine. But as she approached the doorway, his tone caught her attention. Casual, but with an edge she hadn't heard before. "Honestly, it's almost too easy," Jason was saying, his words punctuated by a dry laugh. Clara froze, her hand hovering over the coffee pot. She peeked around the corner and saw Jason leaning against the counter, talking to one of their co-workers, a younger man from another department. His attention was on the coffee and did not scan the room as he talked, and Jason stopped walking right then. "What do you mean?" the co-worker asked, looking slightly uncomfortable. Jason smirked. "You just have to know how to read people. Clara, for example, she's so smart and driven, but she craves validation. Play into that and she'll trust you completely. Clara's breath caught in her throat. Her heart pounded as she pressed herself against the wall, straining to hear every word. "You're talking about Clara?" the coworker asked, frowning. "Of course," Jason replied nonchalantly. "She's an easy mark. Her husband's so uptight it's almost laughable. Just a few well-placed comments, a little extra attention, and boom, he's second-guessing everything, and she's too distracted to notice." The coworker shifted uncomfortably. "That seems manipulative." Jason shrugged, taking a sip of his coffee. "Call it what you want. It's not my fault they let me get under their skin. Besides, it's not like I'm doing anything wrong. Clara is the one who keeps coming to me for advice, for support. I'm just playing my role." Clara felt like the ground had been pulled out from under her. Every interaction, every joke, every moment of Jason's so-called support replayed in her mind, now tinged with an ugly truth she couldn't ignore. Unable to stay silent, Clara stepped into the doorway, her voice trembling with anger. "Is that what you think, Jason? That you're just playing a role?" Jason's expression froze for a moment, but he quickly recovered, flashing his usual disarming grin. "Clara, you weren't supposed to hear that. It's not what it sounds like." "Not what it sounds like," she repeated, her voice rising. "You just admitted to manipulating me and trying to ruin my marriage." Jason's grin faded, replaced by a cold, calculating look. "Clara, come on, don't overreact. I wasn't manipulating you. I was just filling in the gaps where Eric couldn't. You deserved better than what you were getting, and I gave you that." Clara's hands shook as she gripped the edge of the counter. "You think this is some kind of game? That you can just play with people's lives like this?" Jason sighed, rolling his eyes. "You're being dramatic. You wouldn't have even noticed if Eric hadn't made such a big deal out of it. If anything, he's the one who couldn't handle the pressure." Clara's voice cracked as she replied, "This isn't about Eric. This is about you lying to me, manipulating me into thinking you were my friend. How could you do that?" Jason stepped closer, his tone turning icy. "Because I could. Because it worked. And because, let's face it, Clara, you liked the attention. You needed someone to tell you how amazing you are. Don't act like you're some innocent victim here." His words hit her like a slap, but instead of breaking her, they ignited something stronger. A clarity she hadn't felt in months. Clara straightened, her voice firm despite the tears welling in her eyes. "You're a toxic, selfish coward, Jason, and I'm done letting you control my life." Jason shrugged, his smirk returning. "Your loss, but don't expect Eric to stick around when he finds out how easily you let me get to you." Clara stepped back, her chest heaving with a mix of fury and heartbreak. "You don't know anything about Eric, or our marriage, but I'll tell you one thing. I'm not giving you another second of my time." Without waiting for a response, she turned on her heel and walked out, her head held high despite the storm raging inside her. She didn't stop until she was outside, gulping in fresh air as tears spilled down her cheeks. For the first time, Clara saw Jason for who he truly was, a manipulator who thrived on chaos. And for the first time, she realized just how much she had let him intrude into her life. But now she was done. It was time to make things right. The day after her confrontation with Jason, Clara met Megan in the office cafeteria. The weight of their shared experiences hung heavy between them, unspoken but undeniable. Clara hesitated for a moment before speaking. "I overheard Jason yesterday," she said quietly. "Everything you warned Eric about. You were right. He admitted it all." Eric continued. Megan's expression softened, a mixture of relief and sadness. "I'm sorry you had to find out that way. But you know we can't let this continue, right?" Clara nodded, her resolve firm. "Let's report him, together." Later that afternoon, they sat across from HR, recounting Jason's manipulations in detail. Megan shared his history of creating tension in past workplaces, while Clara provided specific examples of his inappropriate behavior and attempts to undermine her marriage. HR listened intently, nodding as they took notes. "Thank you for bringing this to our attention," the representative said. "We take these matters seriously. Rest assured we'll act on this." By the end of the week, Jason was called into a meeting and terminated. Word spread quickly, and his usual cocky demeanor was replaced with a cold glare as he packed his belongings. Though Jason was gone, the emotional toll he'd left behind was undeniable. Clara and Eric were left to pick up the pieces, but this time, they would do it together. The house was quiet that evening. Eric sat on the couch, flipping through channels without paying attention, his mind clouded with the events of the past few weeks. When Clara walked into the living room, he glanced up briefly before turning back to the TV. "Eric?" Clara began softly, her voice tentative. He looked at her again, this time noticing the uncertainty in her expression. "Yeah?" Clara hesitated, then sat down beside him, her hands nervously twisting in her lap. "I owe you an apology. A real one." Eric turned off the TV, giving her his full attention. "Go on." "I've been thinking about everything, about Jason, about how I let him come between us," Clara said, her voice thick with emotion. "I was so blind to what he was doing. I thought he was just being supportive, but the truth is, I ignored the signs. I ignored you." Eric's expression softened, but he didn't interrupt. "I defended him when I should have been listening to you," Clara continued, tears welling in her eyes. "I let him manipulate me into questioning things I never should have doubted, and in the process I hurt you and us." Eric exhaled slowly, his voice calm but firm. "It wasn't just about Jason, Clara. It was about trust. I felt like I was losing you, and every time I tried to bring it up, it felt like I was the one being unreasonable." Clara nodded, wiping a tear from her cheek. "You weren't being unreasonable. You were right, Eric, and I hate that it took hearing it from Jason's own mouth for me to see it. I'm so sorry for putting you through that, for not standing by you when you needed me to." Eric reached for her hand, his grip steady and reassuring. "I won't lie. This has been hard, but I never stopped believing in us, Clara. Even when things felt impossible, I knew we could get through it. But we have to rebuild from here." Clara met his gaze, her eyes full of determination. "I want that too. I know I need to earn back your trust, and I'm ready to do whatever it takes. No more distractions. No more letting someone else get in the way of what we have." Eric nodded. "We need boundaries, Clara, not just with other people, but with how we communicate. If something feels off, we have to talk about it, no brushing it aside." "Agreed," Clara said, squeezing his hand. "I should have talked to you sooner, instead of dismissing your concerns. From now on, we prioritize us. Always." They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of the past few weeks settling between them. Then Clara leaned into Eric, resting her head on his shoulder. "I'm so grateful you didn't give up on me," she whispered. "I never will," Eric replied, wrapping his arm around her. "But this has to be a partnership. No one else gets to define what we have. That's just for us." Clara nodded, a faint smile breaking through her tears. "I promise, Eric. From now on, it's just us." As they sat together, the distance that had grown between them began to shrink, replaced by a renewed sense of connection and understanding. They knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time in weeks, they felt like they were on the same path. Together. In the days following Jason's termination, Megan knew her actions couldn't stop at simply exposing his behavior. The damage he had caused, both to her and others, weighed heavily on her conscience. Determined to ensure he wouldn't repeat his manipulative tactics elsewhere, she decided to take formal action. Her first step was filing a detailed complaint with HR, outlining not only her personal experiences, but also the testimonies she had gathered from colleagues who had witnessed Jason's inappropriate behavior. Megan's report was meticulous, citing specific incidents where Jason had used his charm and influence to create division, particularly between female coworkers and their partners. Jason's actions weren't isolated, Megan explained in her statement. He has a pattern of targeting vulnerable situations, exploiting trust, and sowing discord for his own satisfaction. It's deliberate and calculated. The HR team, already aware of Jason's recent conduct with Clara, took Megan's complaint seriously. As they began their investigation, they discovered that Jason's manipulative behavior extended far beyond his time at their company. Records from Jason's previous workplaces painted a chillingly similar picture. Former coworkers described him as charismatic but toxic, often blurring personal and professional boundaries in ways that left lasting damage. One report detailed how Jason had manipulated another coworker's marriage, leading to a separation, while others highlighted his tendency to create cliques and foster animosity between team members. With these revelations, the HR team escalated their findings, sharing them with higher-level management. Jason's history was now indisputable, and Megan's courage in coming forward had exposed the full extent of his actions. "You're trying to find what?" For Megan, the process wasn't easy. Reliving her experiences and hearing stories from others who had suffered under Jason's manipulation was emotionally draining. But she felt a sense of vindication, knowing that her efforts were making a difference. By the time the investigation concluded, Jason's professional reputation was in ruins. Word spread among industry circles, making it nearly impossible for him to secure another job in the same field. While the emotional scars he left on his victims couldn't be erased, Megan's actions ensured he couldn't continue his destructive behavior unchecked. Megan's stand became a catalyst for change within the company, leading to stricter policies around workplace boundaries and professional conduct, her resilience transforming her pain into progress. Months had passed since Jason's departure, and life had slowly returned to normal for Clara and Eric. They were rebuilding their relationship, rediscovering the trust and connection they had nearly lost. For the first time in a long while, Clara felt a sense of peace. One chilly evening, as Clara sifted through the day's mail, an unmarked envelope caught her attention. Its plain exterior seemed innocuous, but something about it gave her pause. She opened it carefully, her curiosity laced with unease. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a typed message. "It hasn't stopped. Different workplace, same game. Be careful who you trust." No signature, no return address, just those haunting words. Clara's hands trembled as she reread the note. Her mind raced. Could this be about Jason? Had he moved on to another company, another target? The thought made her stomach churn. When Eric walked into the room moments later, he noticed her pale face and the envelope in her hand. "What's that?" he asked, concern evident in his voice. Clara handed him the letter silently, watching as his expression darkened. "This has to be about Jason," Eric said, his voice low and steady. "It sounds like he's already doing the same thing somewhere else." They sat in silence, the weight of the letter pressing down on them. Clara's heart ached for whoever Jason's new target might be. A stranger, unknowingly walking into the same trap she had only narrowly escaped. "We can't do anything," Eric said finally, frustration lacing his words. "But at least we stopped him here. Hopefully someone else will stand up to him like Megan did." Clara nodded, but the unease lingered. She folded the letter and tucked it away in a drawer, unsure of what else to do. As they sat together, the ominous message served as a reminder of how easily manipulation could infiltrate even the strongest bonds. Clara and Eric had weathered the storm, but the scars remained, a testament to the dangers of unchecked deception and the vigilance required to protect what truly mattered. The thought that Jason could continue his toxic cycle elsewhere was unsettling, but it also steeled their resolve to remain united. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together.